Okay, welcome everyone. Got the camera set up. This technology is amazing. This is a video on the parable of the 10 virgins. I came to this parable while writing a book. This is a copy of the book. I'm trying to hold it so that you don't get so much glare. It's called Coming to Jesus. You can see a little bit better on the side there. My name is Lane Delano. You can get the book on Amazon. This is one of the chapters in the book. There's a lot more in the book. The book was actually about a bunch of New Testament stories, and then I came across this interpretation from things I learned in those stories. There's a couple of disclaimers that I need to make. I don't represent anyone. I don't represent a church. These ideas are my own. I own them. And the other thing is that my guess is that some of these ideas are wrong. Maybe all of them are wrong. I had an epiphany a few years ago that it is hubris to think that after a couple thousand years, that I have come up with an interpretation that no one else has figured out in 2,000 years. But along with that epiphany came this realization that most interpretations get lots of things wrong. And so I don't worry about it too much. I really like this interpretation. The reason why I like this interpretation is because it knits together all of chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew together. And just from a broad perspective, Matthew 24 starts with the disciples ask the Savior about what will be the sign of your coming. And he gives an exposition. He just says this will happen and this will happen and this will happen. And then he talks about some events. And then he talks about there's a story of a wise and an evil servant. And then there's the parable of the 10 virgins. And then you have the parable of the talents. And then you learn about the sheep and goats and who gets into heaven and who doesn't. And really that's that last little bit about who gets into heaven are those who serve others and who care about others and feed and clothe them. So that's what's really important. Understanding this parable is kind of secondary, frankly. What's really important is that we learn to take care of other people. So those are the disclaimers. That's who I am. I may split this video into pieces if it gets too long, just to break it up a little bit. And with that, we probably need to talk a little bit about a few things before we get to the parable. So I give you a broad overview of what the parable is like. What the Matthew 24 and 25 are like. And so in order to get a holistic view, by holistic, I mean everything before and after all fits together and it all interconnects in like a beautiful spider's web, and the connections help support the interpretation. And so we can't do that unless we understand Matthew 24. Because the parable of the 10 virgins is a continuation of that sermon. And then the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to reach back to some of Jesus's earlier teachings, and we're going to look at when he used the word servant and when he used the word wise. And we're really only going to look when there's more than just a sentence or two there, so that we can get a little more meat on the bone for what he's saying. And then the next thing we'll do is we are going to discuss parallel structures. And the reason for discussing parallel structures is that the parable of the 10 virgins is a parallel structure. And we're not going to get a lot of mileage out of that, but we're going to get some, and it's enough that it's worth talking about. Plus, if you are unfamiliar with parallel structures, then you need to go find out about them because they are amazing. They make searching the scriptures so much more fun. And you can learn a lot of things from the parallel structures. They're not just memory aids. They are a way for the author to share meaning in ways that we don't understand in the West. So we'll talk just a little bit about that, and then we'll move on. And then we're going to talk about the story of the wise and the evil servant that comes at the end of Matthew 24. And we have to understand that partly because of this holistic spiderweb idea, and also because the story of the wise and evil servant and the parable of the 10 virgins, there are at least 7 connections that I point out, and there are probably a lot more. And if you don't understand how those two passages fit together, you will never understand the parable of the 10 virgins, nor will you really ever understand the wise and evil servant. And that means that you'll be completely blank on what Matthew 24 and 25 mean. And so this holistic view will provide a bunch of clues, and then we'll talk about the parable, and we'll be able to get through it fairly quickly. So the title of this next slide is a little bit weird, Matthew 24, giving birth. The reason for talking about, it's really more of the birthing process, is that the Lord, in some passages it says, I think it's in verse 8, it says, these are the beginning of the sorrows. But in multiple translations, it doesn't say that. It says, these are the beginning of the birth pangs. And and things are really bad in verses 6 through 14, but Jesus says the end is still to come in verse 6. And so the question, the obvious place that your mind goes is the end means the end of the world. But when Jesus comes, that's not the end of the world. When Jesus comes, his reign begins. The world continues. What he's talking about by the end is the end of this birthing process. So when a woman's in labor, the beginning is bad, worse than probably any man has ever gone through. But near the end, when you're actually delivering the child, things intensify. That's the end of the birthing process. And that's the end that Jesus is talking about. And this intensification of the process is what we see. In verses 6 through 14, things are bad. But starting in verse 15, and that's where the break is, kind of right between verses 14 and 15, things intensify. They get far, far, far worse. And understanding this is important. Well, it's not that important, but it's interesting. But even if you abstract away from this idea of giving birth, there's definitely a break that starts in verse 15. And things go from really bad to super, super bad. And so you might ask, well, what's being born? What is this birthing process leading to? And that's not totally clear to me. You could say it's the birth or the beginning of Jesus's reign. You could say that it's the beginning of Zion. I'm not sure. But something new is coming, something to the world. It's like the whole world is in labor. That's the other thing to know. I'm not going to really discuss it. But things are happening on an international scale. And the whole world is involved in a lot of this stuff. Not so much for the parable of the 10 virgins. I'll explain what I mean by that later. That parable only refers to the Lord's church. But it does eventually get to an international version. So we'll get to all of that. So what we have on this slide is just a brief review of the exposition portion of Matthew 24. So the beginning of the sorrows are wars, rumors of wars. I think rumors of wars actually starts first, and then you get real wars, and famine and pestilence and earthquakes. I think the pestilence actually comes from my own religious tradition, and I just slipped that in there. And then the saints are delivered to be afflicted and killed. And that's the time when many saints will be offended and they will betray and hate one another. Now, I want you to remember this right here. This is important. This shows up in the parable of the 10 virgins. And there's a betrayal and a hatred of each other that goes on in that parable. And we see it here in the exposition. And then you have false prophets arising and deceiving, and iniquity gets bad, and then the gospel is preached to the whole world, and then the end comes. And remember, the end is not the end of the world. The end is the delivery process. It's the end of the laboring process. It has a period of time as well. And just generally, this idea of birthing helps put all of this into context, meaning, or maybe better said, it puts everything into a time frame. The world can't be giving birth for 1,000 years. The world is giving birth to whatever's coming over maybe a period of years, maybe 7 years. That's my guess. And so all of these events that the Lord's talking about, they're in a multi-year time frame, not in a 100-year time frame, not in thousands of year time frame. This is a compressed time frame. And my guess is it's 7-ish years or 3.5 years. It's not clear, but it's not a super long period of time. Okay, then we get to verse 15 to 22 here, and that's when the end starts. And it starts with the abomination of desolation, and this is when things go from terrible to near extinction. And the Lord says, if those days were not shortened, all flesh would be toast. And notice here in verses 23 to 27, we get false Christs and prophets arising. Look at what we had up in the beginning of the birth pains. We get false prophets arising. Everything is more intense in the second section, verses 15 to 31. And then you have a bunch of celestial signs occur. Jesus comes and the elect are gathered. And this is what I mean by people are coming to Jesus. And notice there are two places where people are coming to Jesus. People come to Jesus here in verse 14. The gospel is preached to the world. That means that people are coming to Jesus in that process. And then down here, the elect are gathered. So they're not just coming to Jesus, they're coming to a physical place. That's like an exodus. The word gathered means that you're going somewhere. And we're going to see geographical movement in the parable of the 10 virgins. So it turns out that these three themes, the war and destruction theme, a deception of the saints, and then many people being brought to Jesus, repeats itself. And it repeats itself right at that break. So you have the beginning of the birth process in verses around 6 through 14. You might go a little earlier than 6. And then things get really bad. That's where our break starts, right there at 15. And you see more war and destruction. We saw war and destruction in the first part. You see a deception of the saints. So if I go back a slide, see, in verse 12, you got the false prophets are arising and deceiving. And then later on, false Christs and prophets arise. So that's why, now I'm not suggesting that this is a parallel structure. Parallel structures are all over the place, and sometimes we think they're there and they're not, and so you have to be careful. But I do think that the basic pattern repeats itself, and then many are brought to Jesus, and we saw that and we talked about that already. But I want you to keep note of these three main themes. There is wars, rumors of wars, and destruction and famine, and just bad mojo. Then there's a deception of the saints that follows that. And then many people are brought to Jesus. And we've already talked about the beginning of the sequence is the birth pains, and then the end comes, and the delivery is when the birthing process is most severe. So remember, we're talking about a spider web where everything in Matthew 24 and 25 is connected. We need to see this congruence in our interpretation of the wise and evil servant, and in our interpretation of the parable of the 10 virgins. If we don't see a congruence between these three main themes and our interpretation, that's an indication that our interpretation is off. Now, same with the parable of the talents. A lot of people look at the parable of the talents and they talk about, like, I can play the piano, or I can sing, or I have math skills. What has that got to do with the end of the world? What has that got to do with war and destruction, the deception of the saints, and people coming to Jesus? It's got nothing to do with that. And you have to figure out your interpretation so that everything fits together. The parable of the talents has to do with missionary work. That's this part, the coming to Jesus. In fact, it's this 29 to 31 verses right here. And I'll show you that. Just take a little bit on faith right now. I know a lot of this stuff is strange and new and crazy. Just give me a chance. I'll get there. I'll explain it. Okay, because I've been talking about a spider web and congruence, right? We already mentioned that you should expect the broad themes to be connected to, in the exposition of Matthew 24, there should be links to the parable of the 10 virgins. Well, there should be some specific links too. And I'm going to point out a couple here, and they're going to seem odd. I'm just going to tell you now that they seem odd so that you can suspend your disbelief and just go with me for a little bit. And I'm not going to explain them completely. I'm just going to point them out. And the reason for pointing them out is so later on you can look back and say, oh my gosh, that's what that meant. Okay, so first we see that saints are being killed in verse 9. We see the evil servant at the end of Matthew 24, and he beats upon his fellow servants. And I've already mentioned that we're going to connect that evil servant, well, the wise and evil servants both get connected to the parable of the 10 virgins. So there's 3 links there. Second, we see false prophets arise in verse 11 of Matthew 24. The evil servant and his associates are false prophets. And we'll begin to understand that. There's a real twist coming. It's like a murder mystery, and all of a sudden I'm going to spring something on you. I'm just telling you right now, and I'm kind of excited knowing that it's coming, and you don't know that it's coming, and it's going to shock the living daylights out of you. And that's part of what makes this interpretation so fun. Okay, now this next one, it says, where Jesus says not to believe, and this is in the second part of his exposition, not to believe false prophets who say he's in the desert or in secret chambers. Now, this is a remarkable little clue based on the interpretation that I've developed. And it's not going to make any sense right now, but it will make sense later. So just hang on and enjoy the ride as we get there. I'm going to tell you what the answer is right now, and you're going to look at me and you're going to say, this guy's nuts. Just give me a chance. So the secret chambers that the Lord talks about, those are the bridal chambers that the 5 wise virgins enter into. And the wilderness is where the 10 virgins go at the start of the parable of the 10 virgins. The reason why this is so amazing is because it dovetails beautifully into the interpretation. I can't tell you any more right now. All right. Okay. So then last, the false prophets sow deception, and deception is super important to understanding this parable. It's when you see what's going on, you're like, oh my gosh. It's like the Lord has been preparing a sucker punch for his people for a long time. And that's part of what is so crazy about this interpretation is the sucker punch that's coming to the Lord's people. But I want you to remember, if you go and think about what happened to the Jews, they got sucker punched. They totally and completely, and sucker punch is, okay, that's the wrong word. The Lord doesn't sucker punch people. What I'm saying is that the Lord almost said things in a way that led the Jews to believe that that he would come as a national deliverer. I mean, if you go and study Isaiah, and by the way, there was one guy to go study, if you want to understand Isaiah, his name is Abraham Gileadi. He's an LDS scholar. Nobody else understands a tenth of Isaiah as well as he does. In fact, most of the scholars get it completely wrong. And he basically gets it all right. But when you finally begin to understand Isaiah, you realize that there is a national deliverer that the Lord talks about. And the Jews were waiting for him. Look, the Jews know the scriptures. Thinking that the Jews don't know the scriptures is just ridiculous. They wrote them. They're their scriptures. They own them. Their people wrote them. They understand them way better than us Gentiles understand them. And there is a national deliverer that's promised in there. And so they're waiting for this national deliverer, right? This deliverer of the nation. And instead, Jesus comes. And it completely blew the fuses in their minds, as you would expect that it would, right? I mean, and if he did that to the Jews, if God did that to the Jews, you better believe he's got something similar planned for us. And there's a reason why God did this. It's the strangest thing. It completely blows the mind of people who are religious, right? This idea that you believe one thing and your whole culture and everything is built around a certain belief. And then God blows all that up and instead something else happens. But something amazing happens when God does that. By doing that, God sifts people. He sifts out the righteous from the religious. And the righteous see through what's going on and they figure it out and they are saved. And the religious, they cling to their beliefs that are mistaken and they miss the Savior when he comes. And just, I mean, you can see this in the parable of the 10 virgins. Everybody who reads it sees five of the virgins are foolish, right? They're virgins. You don't get to be called a virgin unless you're one of the Lord's people, right? You're clean and you are going to be married to the bridegroom who's Jesus. And then you're not. You miss out. And that's kind of what happened to the Jews. And so we should expect that the same kind of thing's going to happen to us. And that is what we're going to see. And I've kind of given away a little bit of my secret, but it kind of fit right here.